What's the most horrifying real-life death you've heard about?
I spent a career as fireman in a big city. About 15 years ago, we responded to a middle-of-the-night fire in the basement of an old triple-brick, two-story single-family, balloon-frame residence. On this particular weekend, the 9-year-old daughter was having a sleepover. 8 kids and the parents either got out or were pulled out by responders. But we couldn't find the daughter. All efforts on scene were directed to rescue operations, so the fire quickly advanced as firefighters searched throughout the pitch-black, hot-as-fuck structure. My partner and I were searching the second floor, working solely on feel, and we could hear her screaming for help. "Okay, we hear you, we're coming, we got this." My partner and I were experienced. We'd made other rescues. We were professionals in our craft. But the second floor layout didn't make any sense. Doors that could be felt, but were sealed shut. Rooms longer than you would have expected, etc. We learned later that the entire second floor has been remodeled, leaving some of the original design pieces in place, but extending rooms and modifying entrances. It was the hottest fire I've ever been in. With everyone, rightly, focused on more than a half-dozen rescues, the fire was left unchecked, and the thing was just ripping, running vertically through the pipe chases. Eventually, we didn't hear her screaming anymore. We stayed up on that floor well past when the chief wanted us out, throwing our shoulders into faux doors, trying to breach walls into the bathroom, etc., until finally we were out of air. We were outside, telling another crew where our search left off, when the roof collapsed into the second floor. It was hours before we could recover her body. Over a career of fire and EMS, I've seen my share of terrible, tragic shit. You empathize, but you disassociate to a degree. You have to. If you didn't, you'd work one shift and never come back. So I learned not to carry too much horrific stuff with me. We did our best at everything we were called to. Sometimes it worked out. Sometimes it didn't. That has to be enough in this line of work. But that little girl screaming is one of the 5 to 7 calls that I still think about, and can still hear. We did what we could, and we did a lot of good that night. But we failed her.
People being walled up inside of a brick column or wall. The punishment is called immurement. Last one I heard of was a serial killer in the 1800s. They walled him inside the corner of a building. People said they could hear him screaming for mercy for a week before he fell silent. Imagine, inside a cold, damp, pitch-black chamber too cramped to stand up or sit down. Most likely was crawling with bugs. No food, no water, no mercy. I imagine he went mad before the second day was up because he knew death was the only escape. It has been brought to my attention that I had some details off. I had the date and days of torment off. He was screaming for 3 days, and it happened in early 1900s. Someone was kind enough to research it and put a link below. I told this story based purely on my own shoddy memory. I can barely remember a 3-item grocery list, so I thought I did okay. P. My mistake for any misinformation.
I was coming home from baseball practice in high school, and when coming down my street, I see my neighbor across the street outside in the driveway crying. She was 6, and it was pouring. I asked her what was wrong, and all she said was, "Amy's in the closet." I said, "What?" Her parents weren't home, nor were mine. I didn't want to have her explain it, so I asked her to show me. We go in her room, and she's hanging in the closet with a noose around her neck, blood everywhere from slitting her throat and wrist. I picked her sister up as she was sobbing and held her, and called 911. I went to feel her pulse to make sure she didn't have one. I was 16, I had no idea what to do. We sat outside on the porch until the police came. I couldn't get a hold of their parents as I didn't have their phone numbers, and the youngest daughter didn't know. The mom and dad came home, and it was just awful. The scream the mom made will always haunt me, and obviously that whole scene will haunt me. It isn't as horrific as these stories are, but to me, this was just as bad.
Guy I knew of flew himself and his family to Florida from the Midwest for a Christmas Disney trip in his personal plane. He was flying in some lower-seated clouds when his engine died. He tried a couple things to restart his engine, but couldn't get it to come back. When he came out of the clouds, he was over a forest with no way to glide somewhere to land and had to put it down in the trees and hope. The crash killed himself, his wife, and two of his three kids, except for his youngest daughter, who walked 2 miles barefoot in the late December snow to find help, but she survived. The horrific part of it to me, though, is that this guy's plane has two separate fuel tanks, one in the left wing and one in the right wing. The reason the engine died was because it was fuel-starved. The pilot had been flying on a single tank for the entire flight up until that point, but had another wing filled to the brim with fuel. He could have saved his family's lives as well as his own, and prevented his daughter's trauma if he would have just made sure to follow the checklists that pilots of that airframe practice religiously every day that they go fly.
There was an old guy who lived down the road from me. He wasn't good on his feet, so only used the bottom half of his house. He went to go to bed one night, but fell in front of his old electric heater next to his bed in the living room, and couldn't get up again. The poor bloke was cooked alive. When the paramedics turned up, they had to go into the garden to vomit. It was horrific, apparently. I only know this because a couple of family members went to see what was happening when an ambulance turned up at his house. I'm not sure who called it. They said it was truly awful. The guy survived for a while in the hospital with his injuries, but unfortunately passed. He must have been in front of the heater for hours, the poor bastard.
When I was a kid, I pulled up behind the scenes of an accident where a car had swerved off the road and ran into a tree. The car was on fire, and all three passengers were burning. Not sure if dead on impact or just unconscious, but I saw arms hanging out the window. The fire department wasn't on scene, but the cops were. I used to drive by that tree every day for 10+ years and have that horrible flashback every time. I wrote about it in an English paper during college, and my teacher was like, "I think you have PTSD and need to talk with someone." I'd never considered that because it was a small town, and my parents were pretty anti-therapy growing up, so you never really talked about shit that changed you. They just cut that tree down last year, the burn scar on the bark never healed.
The Itaewon incident on Halloween of last year. I was there that night, and I've never understood how people mistook bodies for mannequins until that night. My friends and I mentioned that we thought it might have been part of their Halloween events, until we realized what was actually going on. We had barely just escaped that alleyway and couldn't process any of it. It all happened so fast. Your brain protects you in crazy ways, and I can definitely recognize that I was experiencing extreme shock at the time, but it is absolutely traumatizing to think back on now. Still receiving counseling for it, and have avoided crowds entirely since then.
Years ago, my grandfather was on a search and rescue team of a train crash. For a reason I can't recall, he wasn't allowed to report anyone as dead. He was there just to help find folks and get them help. He told me that he spoke with someone. "I found a body. We'll need someone to come and clean up." To which they replied, "You don't have the authority," or something to that effect, where he cut them off. His body is about 24 yards that way, and his head is another 3 past that, and went to go help someone else. I'm missing a lot of details, partially because he's no longer around to tell the story, and partially because he didn't like telling it.
Went to North Korea on a guided tour. Was arrested at the airport when trying to leave the country. They said he tore down a propaganda poster. He was forced to confess to the crime, whether he committed it or not. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. A year and a half later, he was sent home to the USA where he was in a vegetative state. He was able to breathe on his own and blink his eyes but couldn't communicate anything. It actually appears he had been in the condition since a month into his sentencing. Brain scans showed his brain was quite damaged. Doctors said it looked like it was damaged from oxygen deprivation. His body was actually in pretty good condition, even though he was bedridden in a vegetative state for a year. He died a week after returning home. Doctors think he had a heart attack, which caused the brain to be deprived of oxygen. What caused the heart attack? We'll probably never know.
This was a workplace accident a few years ago that killed a union brother of mine. He came into work early to make up for some time he had taken off. He was using a forklift to dump trash. He hopped off it to do something in front of the lift. The lift was still in gear and slowly crept forward and pinned him in between the dumpster and the lift. If he hadn't come in early, there would have been a ton of other people around, and he probably would have been fucked up but alive. The contractor I currently work for won't let anyone work a shift alone, and we don't just leave when the day is over, we all meet up, make sure everyone is accounted for, then go home. I know it's not the most fucked up death on here, but it really hit home for a lot of guys. I didn't know him, but a lot of people did. There is only about 1,500 people in my union, so when one person dies, a lot of people feel it.
A childhood friend whom I had lost touch with was thrown from his vehicle when he was about 24. The police investigated the crash scene and decided that he had run away to avoid a DUI. They put out a warrant for his arrest. It was 4 days later when an angler discovered that he had staggered around in the forest with a massive head injury until he died by the river's edge. The cops apparently hadn't found any blood trail or footprints, but suddenly they were everywhere. He had been going in circles and bumping into trees for a long time, like a day. He was probably blind and halfway brain dead. Tragic.
My grandfather was a meter reader for Nashville Gas from 1950 to 1988. He was out on his route one day, got to a house, and knocked on the door. The meter was inside the kitchen. The house was one of those shotgun styles, so he could see the kitchen in the back. He yelled for the lady, but there was still no answer. He peered into the kitchen, and he could see the woman bent over, but she wasn't answering. He figured something was wrong, so he let himself in and walked to the kitchen. She was doing the laundry. The machine had these rollers you'd feed the clothes into to squeeze the water out. She must have fed her apron in with the wash, and it pulled her neck into the rollers. He said it was hard enough that it choked her to death and then started making her bleed out. The water in the machine was red. Her husband was out back mowing grass, none the wiser.
6-year-long battle with aggressive leukemia that was not responsive to treatment. It was painful from right before he was diagnosed, and the doctors said the form he had was fatal. My cousin still went for treatments, tried 3 trial ones to see if he could beat it. It only responded to one treatment by slowing down and making it take longer and more painful for the disease to progress. He knew he was dying and kept his spirits up, but had to watch as the rest of the family slowly realized it too. I was the last person to take a picture of him with his wife and kids, and that moment will never leave me. I cry every Easter thinking about Kenny, my best buddy cousin.
My great-aunt never married and/or had children. She was living upstairs from my grandmother apartment, her sister. My grandma passed away a few years ago, and she was the only close family she had left other than us. But we're all living in different cities, so we were still reaching out to her once in a while, so she wasn't feeling all alone, but not on a daily basis because my dad and his brothers all have their life and stuff. After a few months, the new downstairs neighbors who took my grandma's house noticed a weird smell, and at some point there was worms coming out of the airways. It was in the middle of a hot summer. From what we heard from medical staff, she fell down while getting out the bath and probably broke a hip, couldn't get up or call anyone, and just died there on the spot. The heat made it worse, and she was in a decomposed state when they found her.
My own mother's death. She fell off a horse, had a silicone leak in one of her breast implants that caused an autoimmune reaction which turned into scleroderma. The scleroderma led to pulmonary fibrosis, which led to her eventually needing 15 liters of oxygen per hour, which led to heart failure. She passed away in March of 2022. It was a long, heartbreaking, brutal way to go. She dropped down to about 75 pounds, her fingers and toes clubbed from lack of oxygen, and she would just sit there with purple lips and gasp for air. In the last few weeks, she couldn't even walk across the room. As much as I miss her, I'm glad she's not suffering anymore.
Jesus, this made me remember a story my father told me. Several years ago, when he was still a security guard, he would drive around the company's massive property, which included many public roads, unlit and unpaved. One day, around 11 p.m., he's driving in complete darkness when he and his partner see a parked car and a motorcycle to the side of the road. An accident. My dad parks his car and gets out. The first thing he sees is the driver standing outside his car speaking on the phone. The guy is complaining that he couldn't believe how damaged his car was and how much repair would cost. My father then sees the motorcycle's pilot. The man was lying on the ground, gasping in pain, unable to move as his knees bone is literally visible after his leg scraped the ground. His girlfriend was meters away. My father said her helmet had come off during the collision. Hair was missing, and you could see bits of her exposed brain from when her head hit the ground. Still, she was sitting there on the middle of the road, alive but unresponsive, making gurgling noises. My dad said she looked like a broken doll, sat with arms fallen to the sides and torn clothes, covered in blood oozing from her head. But that wasn't all. The driver had a wife and twin boys around 7 or 8 years old. They were also standing outside the car, simply watching the two people on the ground. According to my dad, the kids were so deep in shock, they were pale as ghosts, and their lips were blue. My dad approached the driver, asked if he had called an ambulance. The man said something to the effect of, "Fuck the ambulance. Can't you see how damaged my car is?" Which prompted my father, who was seeing red at this point, to take this phone and break it. The man tried to argue, and my dad ended up with a hand on his gun. Dad told the dude to STFU before he ended him. Them screamed at the wife to get the children behind the car so they didn't have to stare at the scene. Help was called. The couple from the motorcycle was taken to a hospital. Cops arrived on the scene, my father's colleagues, and told him to leave because he was clearly affected too. Later on, he found out the girl didn't make it. I know accidents happen way too often, but the way my father described it and the way the driver behaved just really stick to me.
I was just reading about Adrienne Shelley. She was an up-and-coming director in the mid-2000s. She had just finished directing the movie Waitress, which she also wrote. She was found in her office in New York. It was an apartment that she worked out of. Her husband didn't hear from her after dropping her off in the morning. He went to the apartment and found her hanging from the shower rod in the bathroom. The police thought it was a suicide, and her husband had to convince them that she would not kill herself. The person who killed her made it look like suicide. He gave 2 different stories about how she died. The police didn't believe the first story. He finally confessed to killing her after he tried to rob her.
The 4 people who died in 2016 on the Thunder River Rapids ride at Dreamworld in Queensland, Australia. 2 rafts collided on the conveyor belt, causing one of them to flip into a vertical position. 2 riders were thrown underneath the raft and crushed to death, while the other 2 were thrown into the conveyor belt, where they were shredded and mangled to death like beef in a meat grinder. The survivors were the victims' children, who watched their parents die the most horrific death imaginable. The process of retrieving the bodies was so traumatic that many of the paramedics required counseling afterwards. That story will always stick with me.
Recently heard a story of 2 semi-trucks that got into a head-on collision. It was so bad that the front of the trucks essentially fused together and couldn't be separated. One of the truckers fell into a coma, and when he woke up, he was panicking and asking the nurses and doctors what happened to the sedan. As far as everyone else knew, only the 2 trucks were involved in the wreck, but the trucker insisted there was a third car. Eventually, they go to the scrapyard where the wrecked trucks were and cut them in order to separate them. In between the 2 semis is a sedan with a family of 4 inside pancaked between the wreckage of the trucks.
The Greyhound bus incident. On July 30th, 2008 in Manitoba, Canada, 22-year-old Tim McLean was riding a Greyhound bus along the Trans-Canada Highway. Tim fell asleep against the bus window with headphones on when Vince Lee, who had moved to sit next to him moments prior during a scheduled stop, pulled out a large knife and started stabbing Tim in the neck and chest. The bus quickly pulled over, and all other passengers fled the bus. Attempts were made to rescue Tim, but Lee kept them away by slashing at them with his knife. As he was locked in the bus, he kept pacing back and forth between the front and back ends of the bus, each time taking another stab at Tim's neck until he ultimately decapitated him, after which he proceeded to hold and display Tim's decapitated head to the outside passengers before returning to Tim's body and cannibalizing part of his flesh. Police eventually turn up, and when Lee was arrested after trying to escape the bus, they found one of Tim's ears and parts of his tongue and nose in Lee's pocket. Both of Tim's eyes and parts of his heart were never recovered, presumably eaten by Lee. Where is Vince Lee now, you may ask? Well, he isn't in maximum security prison. He was deemed not criminally responsible for the incident after it was determined he was schizophrenic. He was transferred to a high-security mental health facility in Selkirk, Manitoba, but was later released under supervision in 2015. In February 2017, he was fully and completely discharged with no legal obligations or restrictions regarding his independent living. He is in no way being monitored, supervised, or looked after. Noon is making sure he is taking his medicine for his schizophrenia, and Noon is keeping an eye at where he is, where he goes, and what he does. He lives just as independently as you and me.